The assembly of voices kept a rule older than any delegation currently seated inside it. No one spoke for a species until that species had bled for the privilege, in treaties if nothing else, and Senator Liora Sevrain of Nyxos Aerie had been reminded of that rule in one form or another every session day for the last 2 years. She was reminded of it again in the antechamber outside the main floor, 40 minutes before the vote that was supposed to end it. "They're saying you brought your pet again," said Senator Coral Ashwin of the Ternate block, not quite quietly enough, to the aide standing beside him. He said it in Concord Standard, which meant he intended it to travel, and it did, drifting across the antechamber's low murmur of pre-session small talk and landing exactly where he wanted it to land on Liora, 3 meters away, adjusting the drape of her formal sash with hands that did not shake, because she had trained them for 2 years not to. She did not turn around. Turning around was a tell, and on Nyxos Aerie, where every visible muscle a person owned had to be paid for in scarce caloric reserve and long, careful breeding across 9 low-gravity generations, tells cost more than most delegations understood. Her people had not evolved to hide fear behind stillness because stillness was elegant. They had evolved to hide it because a Nyxari body under stress burned itself, quietly and expensively, from the inside, and a senator who let the assembly watch her burn was a senator who had already lost whatever she came to win. "Pet," she repeated to no one, in a voice pitched for exactly the ears that needed to hear it correct itself. "He carries a blade nobody else in this hall is permitted to carry, keeps to a schedule I don't set for him, and has read every accord this assembly has ratified in the last 40 years, in the original languages for pleasure. I'd be careful what you call an asset like that in front of people who might be listening for a weakness in you instead." A ripple of quiet laughter went through the knot of junior aides nearby, the kind of laughter that cost Ashwin more than he'd spent to provoke it, and Liora let herself feel exactly 1/2 second of satisfaction before she put it away, because satisfaction was a tell too, and because across the antechamber, standing where he always stood, close enough to matter, far enough to let her work a room without his shadow falling across it, Tobin Ashcroft had not so much as turned his head at the word *pet*. He'd heard it. She knew he'd heard it because his weight had shifted a centimeter onto his back foot, the small unconscious recalibration of a man deciding, in the space of 1/2 second, that a threat wasn't worth the energy of acknowledging. Then he'd gone back to watching the room the way he watched every room, not for insults, which cost nothing and meant less, but for the 12 or so specific things that, in his professional experience, tended to precede somebody dying. Liora had asked him once in their first month what those 12 things were. He told her 7 of them, and then said the other 5 weren't the kind of thing you wanted rattling around in your head at a cocktail reception, and she had let it go, because some rules a person kept for reasons that were kindness dressed as discretion, and she had learned slowly which of Tobin Ashcroft's silences were which. "Don't let Ashwin get to you," said a voice at her elbow, low, in the clipped consonants of the Vantic trade dialect run through a translation collar that had never quite smoothed out its speaker's accent. Senator Reth Ovanes of the Vantic Compact had been the closest thing Liora had to an ally on the floor for most of her first term, not out of any particular affection for Nyxos. He had told her once with disarming honesty, but because his own homeworld had spent a century under a nearly identical trusteeship arrangement before buying its way out of it, and he recognized the shape of the argument she was about to make from the inside. He says that to every junior delegate who threatens to actually move a vote, it means you've made him nervous. Men like Ashwin only insult the people they've started to worry about. "I'll try to take it as a compliment." "Take it as data," Reth said. "That's what it is." His eyes moved briefly, unsubtly, to where Tobin stood at his post along the wall. "You're attaché. Is it true he memorized the entire Halon Accord Annex? Ves Corin's office has been trying to get a straight answer out of the Terran mission for a week and getting nothing but diplomatic noise back. He reads treaties the way some people watch serials. I've stopped finding it strange. I'd find it useful, if I were you, to let that particular rumor keep circulating uncorrected. Reth's mouth curved, not quite a smile, the Vantic version of one. An attaché who's read everything is a more interesting kind of asset than a bodyguard, Senator. People underestimate the second thing considerably more than they underestimate the first, and I notice you haven't corrected either impression. She hadn't. She filed the observation away, not because Reth had told her anything she didn't already understand about her own strategy, but because hearing someone else say it back to her, cleanly, confirmed she'd built the right kind of ambiguity around Tobin Ashcroft without ever quite deciding to. The Vernac Compact delegation entered the antechamber at the 11-minute mark, and the room's temperature did not change, because rooms did not actually do that, but every Nyxari in it. There were 4, counting Liora, out of the assembly's 1,100 seated members, felt something in their marrow recalibrate anyway. An old animal arithmetic that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with 3 centuries of a trusteeship arrangement that had never once, in 3 centuries, been renegotiated in Nyxos's favor. Senator Auric Thane moved through the antechamber the way water moves through a channel it built itself. Unhurried, certain, already knowing where every wall was. He was Vernac's senior whip, 7th term, chair of the Trusteeship Oversight Committee for the last 11 years, and the single most dangerous conversationalist in a body of 1,100 professional talkers, because unlike the rest of them, Auric Thane never once said anything he did not mean to be repeated. He stopped in front of Liora at a distance, calibrated to feel companionable to anyone watching, and close enough to be a small violation to anyone who understood Nyxari personal space, which he did, because he had made a study of it the way he made a study of everything useful. Senator Sevrain. He inclined his head a precise 11 degrees, the amount owed to a first-term junior member of a trusteeship delegation, not 1 degree more. I understand you intend to bring a motion to the floor today regarding the Halon Seams classification. I intend to bring the sovereignty accord to a vote, Senator. The seam is a line item in it, not the whole of it. A generous way to describe removing 3 centuries of protective oversight from a system that has never, in that time, been able to defend itself. He said, protective the way a man says a word he has used so many times it has worn smooth in his mouth, no longer requiring belief to deploy. Nyxos owes the compact its survival. I would think that worth remembering before the assembly is asked to unmake the arrangement that provided it. Nyxos owes the compact 11 trillion credits in seam extraction fees over 3 centuries against an initial defense debt that was paid off in the first 40 years, Liora said, and kept her voice at the same even register she'd have used to discuss weather. I have the ledger, Senator. I imagine you have it too, somewhere you don't often look. Something moved behind Thane's eyes, not anger, she'd have recognized anger. Anger was cheap and common, and she'd built a career being unmoved by it. This was colder. This was recalculation. You've done your reading, he said. I've done considerably more than that. She let the words sit exactly as long as they needed to, no longer, and then smiled the small, correct, entirely diplomatic smile that Nyxari junior senators were trained from childhood to produce on demand, and stepped past him toward the floor doors, feeling not seeing, because she did not turn to check, because turning to check was a tell Tobin fall into step 4 paces behind her, on her left, where the doors would open. Tobin Ashcroft had joined the Terran Compact's provisional mission to the Assembly of Voices 14 months ago, on paper as a cultural attaché, grade 3, a designation so deliberately unthreatening that the first 3 security officers who processed his credentials at Meridian Hall had asked him, without irony, whether he did the flower arrangements too. He had let them think what they wanted. It was, generally more useful than correcting them. What his file did not say, because his file had been written by people who understood exactly how much truth a provisional delegation could afford to put on public record, was that he had spent 6 years with the Terran Expeditionary Corps 3rd Forward Surgical and Recovery Group, the unit that went in behind the lines that hadn't held to bring out the people the lines had failed. And that somewhere in year 4, he had stopped being only a medic and started being the man his unit sent in first when the ground between the wounded and safety had stopped being a question of medicine and started being a question of who got there before someone else did. He did not talk about that work. He had found over time that the people who asked him to talk about it were rarely people who actually wanted to hear the answer. What his file also did not say was why he carried a sword. The assembly of voices banned within the walls of the main chamber any instrument scanning as an active weapon, powered sidearms, charged blades, anything drawing from a cell or broadcasting a text signature a chamber sensor could read as lethal intent. It was an old rule, older than most of the delegations currently arguing under it, and it had exactly one exemption, carved out so long ago that most sitting senators had forgotten it existed until someone needed it. The Cultural Heritage article, which permitted any accredited attaché to carry, as a registered item of ceremonial regalia, a single unpowered object of demonstrable cultural significance to their homeworld, on the theory, reasonable, 300 years ago, when the article was written, that a species' history was not a threat merely because it had once involved edges. Earth's provisional mission had registered a straight saber, forged by a retired armorer from Tobin's old unit out of folded battlefield scrap, and a monomolecular edge treatment that had never, technically, been classified as a weapons technology because it had been developed for surgical instruments and had simply turned out in the wrong hands to be extremely good at other things too. It carried no power cell. It broadcast no signature. Chamber sensors read it every time exactly the way the article intended, as a decoration, a costume piece, a quaint provincial gesture from a species still young enough to think a sword said something about who it had been. Liora had asked him in their 2nd month whether it was actually sharp. "It's a sword," he'd said. "If it isn't sharp, it's a very expensive walking stick." "Has it ever been drawn? In anger, I mean, not for ceremony." He'd been quiet long enough that she understood the question had cost him something to answer honestly. "Once," he'd said, "before this posting, I'd rather it stayed once." She had not asked again, but she had noticed, in the months since, the particular attention he paid to the mechanics of the chamber's own security systems. Not out of idle interest, she understood now, but out of the specific professional habit of a man who had learned, at some cost, to know exactly what would and would not still function if everything else in a room stopped working. The once had happened on a relief convoy outside a Terran forward aid station, 2 years before the assembly posting, when a supply corridor his unit had been assured was secure turned out not to be, and the difference between the wounded making it out and not making it out had come down, in the end, to 90 seconds no powered weapon in the convoy could buy, because every one of them had been jammed by the same kind of improvised field a smuggled signal disruptor threw off cheaply and reliably. He had carried a combat knife that day, standard issue, nothing like the saber he wore now, and it had been enough barely, and he had spent a long time afterward understanding that barely was not a word he ever wanted to test again without something better in his hand. The armorer who forged the saber had been in that convoy too. Neither of them had ever needed to explain to the other why the blade existed. He did not tell Liora any of that. He told her, when she asked whether it was actually sharp, that it was a sword, and that if it wasn't sharp it was a very expensive walking stick, and let the joke do the work that the truth would have cost him more to do. Ambassador Corin Dresden had run Earth's provisional mission to the Assembly of Voices for 6 years, long enough to have developed a settled, almost weary fluency in the particular kind of danger, A small delegation courted every time it tried to matter, and he called Liora into his office 2 days before the vote with the specific tone of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and was mostly hoping to be talked out of it. "I've read the brief you gave my legal counsel," he said without preamble once the door had sealed. "The Syndral Combine transfer, 11 accounts. I want you to understand I believe every line of it. But if you name Auric Thane on an open floor with a live feed running, and you're wrong about any single link in that chain, not the substance, Senator, the asterisk chain asterisk, the part a hostile advocate can pull at, you don't just lose the sovereignty accord. You hand the compact a case study in provisional delegations overreaching that will follow every small member world in this assembly for a generation, including mine." He said it without heat, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd raised his voice. "I have one attaché posted to your protection detail because that was the arrangement your predecessor negotiated with mine before you were elected, and I have honored it because Tobin Ashcroft is, by a wide margin, the best close protection officer this mission has ever fielded, and because I trust his judgment more than I trust most of my own staff's. But I want to be honest with you about what I'm risking on your certainty, Senator, because you are not only carrying your own world's case into that chamber. You're carrying mine. I know what I'm carrying, Ambassador." She held his gaze the way she had learned to hold Thane's, the way she had learned to hold anyone's who needed to see, before they decided anything about her, that she would not be the one who looked away first. "I've spent 8 months making sure the chain doesn't have a weak link a hostile advocate can find, because I understood from the first week what it would cost both our missions if it did. I'm not asking you to trust my certainty blind. I'm telling you I've already done the work of earning it, and if you want to review every document in Prieth Call's case file before the vote, I'll have it on your desk within the hour." Dresden studied her for a long moment, the particular measuring look of a man recalibrating an assumption he'd walked into the room already holding. "Send the file," he said. "And Senator, for what it's worth, and I don't say this to every delegate who sits in that chair, I don't think anyone in this assembly has correctly estimated you yet. I intend to enjoy watching them catch up." The evidence had taken Liora 8 months to assemble, working 2 hours a night after assembly sessions ended, in the cramped Nyxos delegation office 3 levels down from the main floor, with a legal aide named Prieth Call who had signed on to translate trade documents, and had instead spent the better part of a year quietly tracing manifest numbers through 6 layers of compact shell registries. What it showed in the end, assembled from customs logs, shipping manifests, and one badly redacted internal compact audit that Prieth had gotten from a disgruntled former quartermaster in exchange for asylum sponsorship, was this. For the last 11 years, under cover of the Trusteeship's protective oversight of the Halon Seam, the Vernac Compact had been running weapons, not defensive materiel, not the kind the Trusteeship's charter permitted, but offensive ordnance, unregistered and untraceable, to a Nyxari separatist faction on the far side of the Aerie, a faction so marginal it had never once posed a credible threat to anything until someone started arming it. The purpose, Liora had understood slowly, piece by piece, the way you understand a wound is worse than it first looked, was not chaos for its own sake. It was leverage. A destabilized Nyxos Aerie, one visibly incapable of governing its own security, racked by an armed insurgency that had appeared from nowhere and would, on schedule, disappear again the moment the sovereignty accord failed. Was a Nyxos Aerie the rest of the assembly would vote, with sad and reasonable faces, to keep under compact trusteeship for another 300 years. The Halon Seam alone was worth more to Vernac's hyperlane relay monopoly than the entire rest of the compact's economy combined. Auric Thane had not spent 11 years chairing the Oversight Committee out of civic duty. He had spent it protecting the single most valuable extraction asset in his species' possession, and he had been willing, when the ordinary levers of assembly procedure started to fail him, to manufacture the very instability he claimed to be protecting Nyxos from. Liora had the shell registry chain. She had the manifest numbers. She had 3 weeks ago gotten the one piece she needed most, a financial transfer, routed through 11 accounts and one very tired former quartermaster's testimony, connecting a compact black account directly to a private military contractor called the Syndral Combine, retained, according to the paperwork Priyeth had finally cracked, for Asset Security Services, Meridian Sector, on a date 4 days before today. She had not told anyone that last part. Not the assembly leadership, not the Terran mission, not even Tobin, though she suspected, from the particular quality of his stillness over the last 3 days, the way his attention had sharpened around the rotation schedule of chamber security without her having said a word to prompt it, that some instinct in him had already found the shape of the thing she was still assembling proof for. You know what happens to the last person who found something like this on Vernac compact accounts, Priyeth had said, the night the quartermaster's affidavit finally came through, not looking up from the terminal where she was cross-checking the transfer dates a third time because a third time was still not enough for either of them. She had been Liora's legal aide for 2 years, hired off a refugee resettlement roster from a Vantic border world with a law degree nobody in the assembly recognized, and a stubbornness that made up for the credential gap twice over. Auditor named Sarath Van, Compact Trade Ministry, 11 years ago, filed an internal report flagging irregular trusteeship extraction fees. Report vanished. So did she, 3 months later, officially reassigned to a records post on a moon nobody's, since been able to confirm exists on current charts. I know the name. I didn't say it to frighten you. Priyeth had finally looked up then, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent a year doing careful, patient, dangerous work, and had stopped pretending, at least to Liora, that the danger wasn't real. I said it because I want you to understand that I know exactly what we're building, and I'm still here at the terminal at this hour, and that should tell you something about how sure I am we're right. I don't do this for people I think are wrong, Senator. I've had other job offers. Why do you do it then? It was not quite a question Liora had asked her directly before, in a year of late nights in the same cramped office. Because Van filed her report, and it disappeared into a system built specifically to make reports disappear, and nobody outside a committee room ever heard her name, until you started asking about her 4 months ago. Priyeth had turned back to the terminal, but her voice had stayed steady, precise, the register of someone who had decided a long time ago exactly what she believed, and had simply been waiting for someone worth saying it to. You're not building a case that disappears into a committee room. You're building one that doesn't fit in the box they built to swallow reports like this. That's worth working late for. Liora had not had an answer for that either that night, beyond staying at the terminal herself until the transfer dates checked out a 4th time. She had decided, 4 nights ago, alone in the delegation office with Priyeth's final document open on the screen in front of her, that she would say all of it on the floor today, in the middle of the Sovereignty Accord debate, with every recording device in the assembly of voices switched on and every senator who mattered watching. Not because it was the safest way to do it. Because it was the only way that made the evidence bulletproof the moment it left her mouth. Because a document could be buried, discredited, disputed for years in committee, but a senator standing on the assembly floor naming names in front of 1,100 witnesses and a live Concord-wide broadcast feed could not be quietly made to disappear afterward without making the disappearance itself the story. It was, she understood, a considerable risk. She had also understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone raised on a low-gravity moon, where every risk had to be weighed against a body's exact caloric cost of surviving it, that some risks were the only kind of safety that actually held. The floor session opened at the 14th hour under presiding speaker Ovesa Drow, An Ilkun stateswoman 11 terms into a speakership nobody had ever successfully challenged, silver-skinned and unhurried, with the particular authority of someone who had watched enough senators overreach to have lost any patience for the performance of it. "The Sovereignty Accord," Speaker Dral announced, in the flat, unornamented cadence the Assembly reserved for matters it took seriously, "comes to this floor for final ratification vote following 11 months in committee. The chair recognizes the sponsoring delegation." Liora rose from the Nyxos bench and felt, in the specific way she had trained herself to feel it without showing it, the weight of 1,100 sets of eyes finding her at once, most of them indifferent, a handful hostile, and one, 3 benches back on the Vernax side, entirely coldly attentive. The procedural fight came exactly where she had expected it to come. Ashwin moved to table for further committee review, a stalling motion with no real hope of passing, but every hope of eating the clock. Liora answered it with a point of parliamentary order she had spent 2 weeks confirming with the Assembly's own procedural council, citing a rarely invoked provision that any motion to table a sovereignty question required a 2/3 threshold rather than a simple majority, and watched Ashwin's motion die on the floor by a margin embarrassing enough that he did not attempt a second one. A Vernac-aligned block from the Thren Compact tried next, requesting a closed-session review of security implications for the proposed trusteeship dissolution, a maneuver designed to move the whole debate behind closed doors, away from cameras, where evidence could be managed instead of broadcast. And Liora killed that one too, invoking the article of public interest, arguing that a vote affecting sovereign resource classification for an entire member world could not, under the Assembly's own founding charter, be conducted outside open session without a unanimous consent she had already, quietly, over the last 2 weeks, confirmed she could deny. She was aware, distantly, of Thane watching her win each of these small fights, with an expression that had stopped looking annoyed sometime around the second one, and had settled into something closer to recalculation, the same look he'd worn in the antechamber. And she understood, with a small grim satisfaction, that he had walked in expecting a junior senator who could be out-procedured, and was instead getting a senator who had spent 8 months studying his own rulebook harder than he had. A third attempt came from an unexpected quarter, Senator Vess Corin of a mid-tier bloc with no particular stake in the trusteeship one way or the other, requesting an amendment that would delay implementation of any dissolution by a further 18 months to allow orderly transition. A motion so reasonable sounding on its face that Liora watched 3 delegations lean toward supporting it before she'd finished parsing why it mattered. 18 months was long enough for a manufactured insurgency to either collapse on its own, taking the evidence of who'd armed it along with it, or escalate into something that made dissolution look reckless regardless of what had caused it. She rose to answer it herself, citing extraction data that showed the Compact's own logistics contracts for the seam were already structured for immediate transition, not gradual, because Vernac's own engineers had never actually believed the trusteeship would last another year. A detail she had found, months ago, buried in a procurement filing nobody had thought a junior senator from Nyxos would ever read closely enough to notice. Corin's amendment failed by a margin that told her, watching the tally board update, that the room had started listening to her math instead of merely tolerating her presence in the debate. Thane did not rise for any of the 3 attempts himself. He sat through each one with the stillness of a man who understood that his own name attached to a losing procedural motion cost him more than losing quietly through proxies, and Liora understood, watching him watch her, that he was recalculating not whether he could stop the vote through the floor's own rules but through some other channel entirely, and that the stillness she read as patience might, in fact, already be something closer to a decision made. "The floor recognizes Senator Sevrain," Speaker Dral said, 40 minutes in, "to present the substantive motion." Liora stood, straightened the drape of her sash with hands that did not shake, and began to speak. She did not begin with the seam's value, or the trusteeship's dead arithmetic, or any of the numbers she had spent 8 months learning cold enough to recite in her sleep. She began with a sentence she had written and rewritten 17 times in the delegation office, because she had understood, somewhere around the 10th draft, that the only way to make 1,100 professional talkers actually listen was to say something none of them had a prepared answer for. 3 centuries ago, she said, this assembly extended a trusteeship to Nyxos Aerie on the premise that my people could not defend themselves. I am not here today to argue that premise was wrong then. I am here to tell you it has been used, for the last 11 years, to manufacture the very danger it claims to protect us from. The murmur that went through the chamber was not the murmur of an audience settling in for a familiar speech. It was the specific, subtly different sound of a room recalculating what kind of session it had walked into. Liora kept going. She named the shell registries. She named the manifest numbers, cross-referenced against compact customs filings that any senator with clearance could pull up on their own console in real time as she spoke, watching, with grim satisfaction, the first ripple of aides leaning toward their principals across the floor. She named the separatist faction on the far side of the Aerie, and the exact dates its unexplained arms buildup had begun, and the exact dates those dates aligned with trusteeship review cycles that had, each time, concluded the same way. Nyxos remained too unstable to release. I want to be specific about what too unstable to release has meant for my people, in practical terms for 3 centuries, she said, and let her voice carry into the register her clerking mentors had drilled into her as a girl, not raised, never raised, but pitched to fill a chamber the way still water fills a basin, without ever seeming to try. It has meant every Nyxari child educated off-world under compact scholarship quotas that cap our representation in conquered institutions at numbers set 140 years ago, and never revised. It has meant every trade agreement my government negotiates passing through a compact review board with veto power over terms we did not help write. It has meant, for 3 centuries, being told by this arrangement's architects that our own low-gravity biology, the very same biology that lets a Nyxari body survive on a caloric budget a heavier species would starve on, is evidence of some deeper fragility, rather than evidence of exactly the opposite. We did not evolve to be defenseless, honored colleagues. We evolved to be efficient. This assembly has spent 3 centuries mistaking one for the other, and I would ask you, before this vote, to consider how conveniently that mistake has served the one delegation that has profited from it the entire time. A Thren delegate 2 benches over made a small sound that might, in another context, have been a laugh, the specific dry appreciation of a professional watching an argument land clean, and Liora allowed herself exactly the smallest flicker of satisfaction before continuing, because the next part was the part that mattered, and she needed the room's full attention exactly when she reached it. She had not yet said the name Syndral Combine. She had not yet said the name Auric Thane, out loud on the record in front of a live feed. She was 3 sentences from both, and she felt the room's attention narrow toward her the specific way a crowd's attention narrows just before something it has been waiting for finally arrives. And in the gallery above the Vernac bench, she saw Auric Thane rise from his seat, not to object, not through any channel the floor's own procedure recognized, but simply standing, unhurried, the way a man stands when he has decided a debate is no longer the instrument that matters. He caught her eye across the width of the chamber, and inclined his head the same precise 11 degrees he had given her in the antechamber that morning. And Liora understood, in the half-second before she opened her mouth to say the name Syndral Combine for the first time on the record, that whatever was about to happen had already been decided somewhere she hadn't been able to reach it, and that the only thing left to control was how she met it. She was 3 sentences from both when the lights in the assembly of voices went out. They did not go out entirely. The chamber's emergency lighting kicked in half a second later. The low amber washed the assembly's own charter required for any total power failure. And in that half second of true darkness, Liora heard, close behind her on the Nyxos bench, the specific sound of a scabbard's mouth releasing its blade. Not drawn yet, just freed, the way a hand rests on a door before deciding whether to open it. "Sit down," Tobin said, very quietly, close to her ear, in a voice that had none of the careful diplomatic register he used in public, and all of the flat-clipped cadence she had heard exactly once before, months ago, during a drill he had insisted on running with the Terran mission's junior staff that everyone else had found faintly ridiculous at the time. Now, she said. Around them, the chamber was already unraveling into confusion. 1,100 senators and their aides, none of them combat-trained, most of them from species that had never in living memory experienced a total systems failure inside the single most secure structure in conquered space, standing, calling out, reaching for console terminals that had gone dark along with everything else. The amber emergency lighting through long, strange shadows across benches designed for 100 different body shapes, and under the confusion, Liora felt, distinctly, the specific quality of silence that came from every powered device in the room having simultaneously died, not flickered, not glitched, died all at once, the way nothing died by accident. The hollow ward, she understood. In the half-second it took her professional composure to catch up with the animal part of her brain that had already understood it. Her own reform. The measure she had championed a year ago, after a bribery scandal in the Assembly's Finance Committee, had turned on a smuggled signal jammer used to spoof a vote tally. A chamber-wide dead field, triggerable from the speaker's dais, that killed every wireless networked and powered weapon system inside the hall the instant a security override engaged, forcing every system in the building onto isolated hardwired circuits until it released. She had built it to stop corruption. She had never once, in the year of committee work it had taken to pass it, imagined it as a weapon someone could point at her instead. Because a dead field did not care who it was killing power for. It killed the chamber's automated defense turrets, mounted discreetly along the upper gallery, and never once fired in 300 years, exactly as thoroughly as it killed anyone else's sidearm. It killed the comm relays that would otherwise have carried an alarm to Meridian Hall's outer security cordon in under 2 seconds. It killed, Liora understood with a lurch of genuine fear, finally breaking through the trained stillness, every single weapon in the room that ran on a power cell. It did not kill a folded steel blade with no power cell to lose. "They planned this," she said low to Tobin, not a question. "They planned the field going down," he said. His eyes were already moving across the chamber, cataloging exits, cataloging the amber-lit shapes moving through the doors at the gallery's east and west approaches in formations too clean, too practiced for panicked security staff. Somebody with chamber-level access triggered a real override, not a fake one, which means somebody on the inside gave them the code. "Stay low. Stay behind me. If I tell you to move, you move first and you don't wait to see why." 6 of the newcomers moved into the chamber floor from the east approach, wearing the gray and silver of chamber security so precisely that it took the room a full 3 seconds to understand, collectively, that chamber security did not carry weapons drawn on the open floor, ever, under any circumstance the Assembly's charter permitted. And by the time that understanding arrived, 3 seconds was already 1 second too many. "Assembly of Voices," said the lead figure, a broad-shouldered woman with a compact standard accent flattened by years of contract work across a dozen systems, her voice carrying without amplification because the room's own dead acoustics did the work for her. "You are instructed to remain seated. This is a security lockdown, authorized under Emergency Provision 9. Any senator or delegation staff who attempts to leave the floor will be treated as a threat." It was, Liora recognized with the small, distant clarity of someone cataloging a lie even as it frightened her, an almost perfect impersonation of a legitimate protocol. Emergency Provision 9 existed, had been invoked twice in the Assembly's history, and did, in fact, authorize exactly this kind of restriction. The woman had done her homework. She had the uniform, the procedure, the confident, unhurried cadence of someone who expected to be believed. She had not, Liora understood, expecting to be *checked*, because checking meant someone in the room who actually knew Emergency Provision 9's real authorization chain, and provisions like that were not the kind of thing junior senators from provisional delegations were generally expected to have memorized. Liora had memorized it 8 months ago, cross-referencing every emergency clause in the Assembly's charter while she built the case against Thane, because she had understood, with the particular paranoia of someone who had spent a year staring at how power actually moved through this institution, that the same tools that could expose corruption could also be turned into cover for it. Emergency Provision 9, she said quietly to Tobin, not the woman, requires dual authorization from the Speaker and the Sergeant at Arms. Dral hasn't spoken since the lights went. Nobody's confirmed the Sergeant at Arms is even alive. Then it's not real, Tobin said. It's real enough to have gotten them in the door. Around them, the chamber's confusion was curdling into something worse. Not panic yet, but the fragile, brittle quiet of 1,100 people deciding, individually, whether to believe the woman with the weapon or the small, cold voice in the back of their mind, insisting something was wrong. 3 benches over, an elderly Thren delegate had risen from his seat despite the instruction to remain seated, moving with the confused, aimless urgency of someone whose body had simply decided to leave without consulting the rest of him. And one of the gray and silver figures at the east approach raised a weapon that, Liora registered with a fresh, cold spike of fear, was not drawn on a power cell at all. A compression blade, mechanically actuated, dead field proof by design. Because whoever had planned this had planned for the field killing everyone's guns except their own. "Stand down," the woman called out, to the Thren delegate, in a voice that had stopped pretending to be a security officer and started being exactly what she was. Liora moved before she had finished deciding to. She rose from the Nyxos bench, low, using the confusion of the amber light and 1,100 bodies as cover the way she had once, as a clerking apprentice 14 years old and desperate not to be noticed in a building full of adults who mattered, learned to move through crowded rooms without drawing an eye. She had spent 2 years of her clerking apprenticeship in this exact building, before she was ever elected to anything, running documents between committee offices through the service corridors that ran beneath the main floor. Corridors most sitting senators had never once set foot in, because senators did not carry their own paperwork. She knew a door out of this room that no one currently holding a weapon in it had any reason to know existed. Ashcroft, she said, using his surname, the register she used only when she needed him to hear an instruction and not a request. The Thren delegate, 2nd bench, east side. I can get him and the ones near him to the archive corridor. I need 30 seconds. You don't move alone in a live room. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you where I'll be so you don't waste time looking for me somewhere else. She met his eyes for exactly the length of time it took to be sure he understood the difference between an order and a request, and found, in that half-second, something in his expression settle, not agreement, not quite, but the specific recalibration of a man deciding that arguing would cost more time than the argument was worth. 30 seconds, he said. Then I come get you, regardless of what you say about it. She got 11 people to the service corridor door in the amber dark, the elderly Thren delegate and the 4 staffers who'd frozen near him. A Vantic trade attaché with a leg injury from the initial crush of bodies. 3 junior aides who had simply followed the first person moving with purpose because purpose, in a room full of panic, was its own kind of gravity. and at the last moment, Priyeth Kaul, who had been 3 rows back working a dead console, and had looked up in time to see Liora moving and understood, faster than anyone else in the chamber, exactly what she was doing and why. The corridor door was old, unpowered, opening on a mechanical latch that predated every electronic lock the assembly had installed since, because it had been built in an era when a door's security came from people simply not knowing it was there. It stuck the first time she threw her weight against the release bar, swollen with 2 centuries of humidity the maintenance schedule had never quite kept pace with, and for one long cold second, she felt the specific fear of a plan failing at its first physical obstacle. 11 frightened people bunched behind her in the amber dark and a door that would not open. And then it gave, all at once, with a shriek of old metal loud enough that she was certain, for half a heartbeat, it would draw every weapon in the chamber toward the sound. None did. The confusion on the floor was still too total, too many bodies moving in too many directions, for one groaning door to register as anything but part of the general chaos. "Through, quickly, stay against the wall," she told the elderly Thren delegate, whose name she did not know and would learn only later was Elder Vashit Owen, 7th longest-serving member of the entire assembly, currently being half-carried through a service door by a first-term junior senator from a world most of his own staff could not have located on a star chart before today. He went without argument, which told her, more than anything else about the last 90 seconds, exactly how frightened he actually was beneath the dignity he'd otherwise have insisted on. The Vantic attaché came next, favoring the injured leg, gripped by one of the junior aides on either side. Then the aides themselves, 3 of them, wide-eyed, moving with the loose-limbed unsteadiness of people whose bodies had not yet caught up with what their minds understood was happening. Liora had it open in 4 seconds after that first stuck attempt, ushering bodies through into the dim maintenance-lit passage beyond, and was turning back for a last look at the floor, a habit, checking that she hadn't left anyone behind who could still be reached when she saw Tobin. He had not stayed near the bench where she'd left him. He had moved, in the 30 seconds she'd spent getting 11 frightened strangers to a door most of them hadn't known existed, to intercept the gray and silver woman's second team before it reached the west approach, where Liora understood in the half-second it took her stomach to drop. A cluster of nearly 40 senators, mostly from smaller delegations without the reflexes or the local knowledge to move, stood exposed and unmoving in the confusion. The blade was drawn. She had never seen it drawn before. She had asked him once, months ago, whether it had ever been used in anger, and he had told her, with the particular quiet of a man setting down a weight he did not want to describe further, that it had once, and that he'd rather it stayed once. She understood now, watching him move through the amber dark with a stillness that had nothing performative left in it, that whatever the once had cost him, he had not forgotten a single thing it had taught him. The first of the gray and silver figures came at him, with a compression blade in a clean, professional arc meant to end the engagement in one motion, and Tobin was not where the arc expected him to be, had stepped inside it instead of away from it, the folded steel catching the compression blade's shaft at an angle that turned the attacker's own momentum against the joint of his own wrist. And the mechanically actuated weapon clattered to the chamber floor a full second before its owner understood he no longer held it. Liora had time to register that much, and then Priyeth's hand closed on her arm, hard, pulling her back through the corridor door, because staying to watch was not, in fact, the same thing as helping, and the 11 people she had already gotten this far still needed someone to lead them the rest of the way. The archive corridor ran beneath the assembly floor in a loop that predated the chamber's modern security architecture by 2 centuries, connecting the old paper record vaults kept, by ancient statute nobody had ever bothered to repeal, in physical hard copy no data corruption could touch, to a set of hardwired terminals used in ordinary times by researchers who preferred sources a dead field couldn't erase. Liora knew, because she had spent 2 years of her clerking apprenticeship in exactly this corridor, that those terminals ran on a closed physical circuit, installed before the assembly's wireless network existed at all. Isolated by design from every system, a dead field was built to kill. She got her 11 people settled in the vault's inner chamber, checked the Vantic attaché's leg wound with hands that had learned enough emergency field care from Tobin over 14 months to at least stop the bleeding properly, and then went, with Priyeth close behind her carrying a data slate that had mercifully been offline, and therefore untouched when the field went down, to the nearest hardwired terminal. "You're going to broadcast now," Priyeth said. "It wasn't a question. From here. While it's still happening is the only version of this that can't be buried afterward." Liora's hands were steady on the terminal's manual interface, an old physical keyboard of a design her people had stopped manufacturing a century ago, kept in service here because nothing about the archive vault had ever needed to be modern. If Thane's people control the floor long enough to clean up after themselves, this becomes an unfortunate security incident with a very convenient explanation. If it's still live when the evidence goes out, it becomes the thing it actually is. The archive terminal's connection ran. She knew from 2 years of apprenticeship and 8 months of increasingly paranoid research, not just to the assembly's own physical record, but to a hardwired backbone shared with every conquered member world's embassy archive, slow, ancient, and because it had never once been worth anyone's time to compromise a channel nobody used for anything but historical research. Completely untouched by whatever access the Syndral Combine's inside source had given them to the Chamber's modern network. It would reach every delegation on the Assembly's active member rolls. It would not, she understood with a small grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with finally being believed, be something anyone could later claim had not happened, because it was happening now, in real time, time-stamped against an active security lockdown that 1,100 witnesses had lived through. She opened the channel, she began to speak. On the chamber floor, Tobin Ashcroft had stopped counting how many of them there were, because counting cost attention he needed somewhere else, and had settled instead into the older, simpler calculus his old unit had drilled into him until it no longer required thought. Which threat reaches the exposed civilians first, and how much time do I have to be the reason it doesn't? The gray and silver team had not expected the sword. That much was obvious in the half-second hesitations that kept costing them ground. A compression blade was a weapon built for other compression blades, for a fight against people who understood the same modern grammar of leverage and power-assisted force, and none of them had trained, not once in whatever contract work had brought them here, against a folded steel edge wielded by a man who had learned to move a blade the way his old unit's armorer had taught him, in the dead hours between deployments, as something closer to a discipline than a tactic. He put 3 of them down in the first 90 seconds, not killed. He registered distantly, because some part of him even now was keeping the older accounting his training had never quite let go of. Joints turned wrong, weapons stripped, bodies redirected into each other in the amber dark with the specific economy of a man who had run out of patience for anything that wasn't necessary. The 40 senators at the west approach had begun, finally, moving not toward safety exactly, because none of them knew where safety was in a building whose every modern system had just died, but away from the fighting, which was, in the moment, close enough. The woman who had first claimed Emergency Provision 9 watched him from the gallery stair, with an expression that had stopped being professional confidence 3 engagements ago, and settled into something closer to recalculation. The same look Thane had worn in the antechamber that morning, the specific look of someone realizing the variable they had least accounted for was about to cost them the entire operation. "Kill the attaché," she said, into a comm unit that, Tobin registered with grim satisfaction, had gone dead along with everything else the moment the field engaged. meaning the order went nowhere, meaning whatever coordination her team had left was about to fall apart in the amber dark exactly as badly as everything else in the room already had. The lead operative who came for him next moved differently than the first three, slower, more careful, reading him instead of simply attacking, and Tobin understood, in the half-second before the man closed the distance, that this one had actually trained against edged weapons at some point, had studied the specific grammar of a blade the way the others hadn't bothered to. His name, Tobin would learn later, was Vask Orin, and he had been Syndral Combine's contract commander on 11 prior jobs, none of which had ever required him to personally engage. "You're going to lose this," Vask said, in accented Concord standard, circling at a distance that respected the reach of a blade he clearly understood better than his colleagues had. "The field drops in 6 minutes. My extraction team clears this hall before it does, with or without your senator breathing." "She's not in this hall," Tobin said, and watched something flicker across Vask's face that told him, with the particular cold satisfaction of a man who had spent 14 months learning to read exactly this kind of professional's tells, that the man had not known that, and that not knowing it had just cost his entire operation something he hadn't budgeted for. Vask came in low, a feint toward the leg meant to draw a defensive drop before the real strike arrived at head height. And it was, Tobin registered in the narrow, patient part of his mind that had never quite stopped running the old unit's drills even 4 years out of uniform, a genuinely good technique. Wasted on an opponent who had spent the last 14 months keeping his own reflexes honed on a training mat in the Terran mission's basement precisely, because he had never once let himself believe a posting this quiet would stay quiet forever. He didn't drop for the feint. He stepped through it instead, closing the gap Vask's own committed motion had opened, and turned the second strike aside with the flat of the blade rather than the edge, because the flat cost an opponent a wrist, and the edge cost him considerably more, and some part of Tobin's training had never stopped keeping that arithmetic even in a fight he fully expected to be the last one he walked away from. Vask recovered faster than the first three had. He rolled the wrist strike into a shoulder check that connected hard enough to drive Tobin back a full step, used the space to draw a compression baton from his belt in a two-weapon stance that told Tobin, with grim clarity, exactly how much of his contract career this man had actually spent training instead of merely collecting fees, and pressed the advantage in a combination that would have ended the engagement against 9 fighters out of 10 Tobin had faced in 6 years of forward deployment. He was the 10th. He gave ground on the baton side, let Vask's own forward momentum carry him a half-step past where his balance wanted him, and put the saber's pommel into the side of the man's jaw with an economy of motion that had nothing showy left in it. Because showy cost energy, he did not have to spare with a bullet wound bleeding freely under his collar and 30-odd senators still exposed at the west approach behind him. Vask went down. He did not get up again before the field released. At the west approach, the last of the gray and silver operatives had broken formation entirely, 2 of them retreating toward the east doors under the specific pressure of watching their contract commander lose a fight they'd been assured, going in, would never happen, and Tobin let them go, because chasing them cost time the wound in his shoulder was already spending faster than he liked, and because the 40 senators behind him mattered considerably more than 2 contractors' extraction odds. The evidence Liora had spent 8 months assembling took 4 minutes to lay out in full over the archive terminal's channel, the shell registries, the manifest numbers, the disgruntled quartermaster's testimony, and at the end, the financial transfer she had saved for last, the black account payment routed through 11 intermediaries to a private military contractor called the Syndral Combine, retained for asset security services, Meridian Sector. Dated 4 days before an active armed incursion into the single most secure chamber in conquered space, during a vote that would have ended a 3-century trusteeship worth more to Auric Thane's home compact than any other asset it held. I am transmitting this, she said, into the archive terminal's ancient microphone, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect it to be, during an active security incident on the assembly floor, so that no one watching can later claim it was fabricated after the fact to explain what is happening. Senator Auric Thane authorized this operation. The evidence is time-stamped, verified, and now permanently on record across every member archive on this network. I would ask any delegation currently receiving this to alert your own security escorts, because I do not know, as I say this, whether my own assembly floor still has people on it who are safe. She closed the channel. Beside her, Priyeth had gone very still, staring at the confirmation ping that told them the broadcast had reached, at minimum, 41 member archives before the connection's ancient bandwidth finally saturated and cut it off. 41, Priyeth said. Out of 206, it's not everyone. It's enough, Liora said, and found, standing in the dim archive vault with 11 strangers she had led to safety, and a data trail she had spent 8 months building finally, irreversibly public, that the fear she had been holding at bay through sheer trained discipline for the last 11 minutes had not, in fact, gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting for her to stop needing to outrun it. She thought of Tabin on the floor above her and made herself stand up anyway. Auric Thane found her on the archive stair 4 minutes later, alone, having left the Vantic attaché and the others in Priyeth's care with an instruction to stay hidden, that she fully expected them to ignore the moment she was out of sight, because that was, in her experience, precisely what frightened people who had just watched someone else act did. He had a compression pistol in his hand, powered, she registered with a fresh cold spike of understanding, which meant it should have died with everything else, which meant someone had given him a dead field-proof weapon specifically, which meant he had known, going in, exactly what kind of field he intended to trigger and had prepared for it accordingly. You were supposed to still be on the floor, he said. The plan accounted for you on the floor. I stopped following your plan somewhere around the part where I read your quartermaster's affidavit. She did not move. Moving, at this range with that weapon, was the wrong kind of tell, and she had spent 2 years learning exactly which stillness read as fear, and which read as something the person holding a weapon had to stop and reconsider. She chose the second kind now, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to hold a room's attention on Nyxos Aerie long before she had ever set foot on this station. You should have killed the transfer trail 11 years ago, Senator. You got greedy instead. 11 accounts is a lot of accounts to keep clean forever. Greed. He said the word like it insulted him, which she understood it did. Thane had never once, in 11 years of committee testimony she had studied, described his own conduct in any terms less flattering than asterisk stewardship, and hearing it named plainly, by a junior senator he had spent 2 years failing to take seriously, cost him something he had clearly not budgeted losing tonight. I built the Compact's hyperlane monopoly with that seam, Senator Sevrain. I built the stability this entire sector's trade routes depend on. You'll unmake 3 decades of careful architecture in an afternoon, because you've decided your world's pride matters more than the order that's kept it fed. My world's pride, Liora said, was never the thing on trial here. Your architecture was. An architecture built on 11 years of arming the people you claim to be protecting us from was never stability, Senator. It was a very expensive, very patient way of making sure you'd always be the only one holding the blueprint. 41 archives, he said, not all of them. Not enough of them in the time this takes. You'd be amazed how few need to matter once the ones that do start talking to each other. She held his eyes and found, somewhere in the trained Nyxari stillness she had spent 2 years perfecting, a version of herself that was not performing calm for an audience anymore but had simply, somewhere in the last 11 minutes, stopped being afraid of him in the specific way that mattered. You've already lost, Senator. You're just the only person in this stairwell who hasn't finished doing the arithmetic yet. He raised the weapon anyway, because men who had spent 11 years believing their own leverage tended to keep believing it a beat longer than the evidence supported. And Liora had just enough time to understand, with the strange clear calm of someone who has already done the only thing that actually mattered and finds the rest almost incidental, exactly what she was, and was not afraid of in that final half-second, not the dying, which her body's own low-gravity arithmetic had spent a lifetime teaching her to hold at a certain careful distance, but the possibility that Thane might somehow still find a way to make the evidence not matter. To spin a senator's death on an archive stare into one more manufactured instability, one more reason a fragile little moon needed someone else's protection after all. She would not, she understood with a clarity that had nothing left in it of fear, give him that story to tell. She had already told the true one, 41 archives deep and irreversible, and whatever happened on this stair in the next half-second could not unmake it. She was not going to be fast enough to do anything about it herself. When the stairwell door above them opened, and Tobin Ashcroft came down it 2 steps at a time with a folded steel blade still wet from an engagement she had not seen the end of, and put himself, without breaking stride, exactly between the weapon's arc and the woman it was aimed at. The shot, because the weapon still fired, dead field-proof by design, the one gun in the building that still worked, took him high in the left shoulder, spinning him half a turn with the impact, and he did not go down. He closed the remaining distance in the same motion the impact had started, inside the pistol's next arc before Thane could bring it to bear a second time, and the blade that had, according to the man who carried it, only ever been drawn in anger once before, was drawn now for the second time in 14 months, and did not miss. The dead field released at the 6-minute mark exactly as the woman on the gallery stair had promised, though not, by then, in service of anything her employer had planned for. Power returned to the assembly of voices in a cascading wash of restored lighting and rebooting terminals, and with it came the chamber's automated defense turrets, the comm relays that finally, belatedly, carried an alarm to Meridian Hall's outer security cordon, and the arrival, 90 seconds later, of the actual sergeant-at-arms and 40 armed Concord security officers who had spent the last several minutes fighting their way through a lockdown they had never authorized. They found a chamber floor scattered with disarmed operatives, most of them alive, several of them explaining, with the particular candor of contractors who had just watched their extraction plan collapse and their employer's guarantee of legal cover evaporate along with it, exactly who had hired them and why. They found Senator Auric Thane on the archive stair, disarmed, and Senator Liora Sevrain of Nyxos Aerie kneeling beside a bleeding human attaché with her hands pressed hard against a shoulder wound, applying, with the specific competent economy of someone who had spent 14 months absorbing field medicine from exactly the man now bleeding under her hands, pressure to a wound she had learned to recognize was serious but not, if she moved fast enough, fatal. The sergeant-at-arms, a broad-shouldered Ilkun officer named Vesicor who had spent 11 minutes fighting through a lockdown she had never authorized to reach a floor she'd been told, falsely, she no longer had jurisdiction over, took one look at the scene on the stair, a compact whip disarmed and silent, a Nyxari senator with blood on her hands that was not her own, a bleeding human attaché who was, against every reasonable expectation the last 6 minutes should have produced, still conscious and still talking, and made the only call the evidence in front of her actually supported. "Cuff the senator," she told her deputy, nodding at Thane. "Get a medical team up here for the attaché before you do anything else. And somebody find out how in the 9 hells a compression pistol was still live inside a triggered dead field, because that's not a question I'm equipped to answer standing on this stair." It was, Liora would learn later, the single detail that broke the case open faster than even the archive broadcast alone might have. A weapon that should not have fired, in a field that should have killed it, traced within 6 hours to a specialized dead field-proof modification available from exactly one supplier in Meridian Sector, A supplier whose billing records led, with wearying inevitability, back to the same 11-account chain Priyeth had spent a year tracing through shell registries. Ambassador Dresden found her in the mission's outer waiting room 40 minutes after the medical team had taken Tobin, still in the same formal sash, still with someone else's blood dried along the edge of her hands, where the med team hadn't had time yet to help her clean it off. "I read the file you sent," he said, sitting down across from her without asking, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the last hour fielding calls from a conquered security apparatus that wanted very badly to understand how a provisional mission's ceremonial attaché had ended up the only person in the assembly of voices still capable of fighting when it mattered. Every line of it held. "I want you to know that. I also want you to know I spent most of tonight assuming I was about to be drafting your world's condolences instead of its ratification, and I would like it on record, Senator, that I have never in 6 years been happier to be wrong about anything. You weren't wrong to worry. I was gambling with your mission standing along with mine. I told you that in your office. You told me you'd done the work of earning your certainty. You didn't tell me you'd also have a man willing to take a compression round meant for you rather than let the certainty die with you on an archive stair." Dresden's voice had gone quieter, the register of a man setting down something he didn't often say out loud. "Earth's provisional status has been sitting in committee limbo for 6 years, Senator, because no one in this assembly could point to anything my mission had actually done to earn a vote on it. We've been useful, quiet, careful, exactly the way every provisional delegation is told to be if it wants to survive long enough to matter. Tobin Ashcroft just gave this assembly something to point to instead. I intend to make sure they can't look away from it. He'd tell you he was just doing the job. I know precisely what he'd tell me. I've read his file. It's why I'm the one saying it instead of asking him to." Dresden allowed himself briefly something that was almost a smile. "Get some rest, Senator. Both our worlds are going to need you conscious for what comes next." "Stay awake," she told him. In the flat-clipped register she had never once, in 14 months, heard herself use before, and understood distantly that she had learned that register from him too. "You don't get to be the reason I finish this speech alone." "Wasn't planning to," he said, through his teeth, and something in the strain of it was almost amusement. "Somebody has to carry your bags out of here." Job description. The Sovereignty Accord came back to the floor 9 days later, after a Concord-wide investigation had confirmed every line of the evidence Liora had broadcast from the archive vault, after Auric Thane had been formally expelled from the Assembly under the Founder's Clause. An ancient provision, rarely invoked, permitting immediate removal without the Assembly's usual months-long procedure, when corruption was documented in the literal commission of an act against the body itself. And after the Vernac Compact, in the wreckage of a scandal that had cost it 3 committee chairs and the confidence of half its own delegation, had quietly withdrawn its opposition rather than let the vote become a longer referendum on exactly how deep the rot had gone. Liora stood at the well of the assembly floor to close the debate in the same sash, at the same podium, under the same amber-tinted architecture that had, 9 days ago, gone dark around her, and found that the 1,100 sets of eyes on her now held something she had not felt from this room in 2 years of trying to earn it. 3 centuries ago, she said, this assembly extended a trusteeship to my homeworld on the premise that Nyxos could not defend itself. I told you, 9 days ago, that the premise had been weaponized against us. I want to be precise about something else today, because I think this assembly has spent long enough being precise about everything except the thing that actually mattered. Nyxos was never the ones without defenses in this chamber. We simply understood, better than the people counting on our fragility, that the strongest thing a small world can build is not a weapon. It's proof. Evidence that survives the people who'd rather it didn't. A record nobody can quietly erase. That is what my world brought to this floor 9 days ago, And it is, I would submit, considerably harder to disarm than anything with an edge. The vote passed when it came, by a margin so wide it barely required a formal count. 311 votes clear of the threshold, Nyxos' Aerie's sovereignty over the Halon seemed ratified, its trusteeship dissolved, its full voting membership in the Assembly of Voices confirmed after 3 centuries of provisional standing, and tabled as a companion measure that Liora had insisted on adding in the days since, Earth's own provisional status elevated as well, on the strength of an attaché whose service record the Assembly's security review had finally, formally, been forced to actually read. The tally board's amber-lit count climbed past the threshold to a sound Liora had never once heard the Assembly of Voices make in 2 years of sitting in it. Not the polite, controlled acknowledgement a chamber gave a routine ratification, but something looser, louder, delegations from a dozen small worlds who had spent their own centuries under one trusteeship arrangement or another finding, in Nyxos' Aerie's vote, a small piece of proof that the arithmetic could in fact be beaten. Senator Reth Ovanes caught her eye from 3 benches over and inclined his head, not the Vantic almost smile from the antechamber but something plainer, and mouthed a single word she read easily across the distance, asterisk data. Speaker Ovessa Drow gavelled the chamber back to order with the patient authority of 11 terms, but even she let the moment stretch a beat longer than procedure strictly required before she spoke. Let the record show, the speaker said, that the Assembly of Voices has on this date corrected an error 3 centuries in the making. It is worth noting, for whatever it is worth to the delegates present, that it took a first-term senator from the world in question to force the correction, and not this body's own institutional conscience. I would ask every delegation in this chamber to sit with that fact for longer than the length of this session. It was not strictly in order. Speaker Drow gavelled the point closed before anyone could object to it anyway, and Liora understood, watching her do it, that 11 terms of authority bought a speaker exactly the kind of latitude to say a true thing out loud that a first-term senator never quite had, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something like gratitude toward the institution itself rather than merely toward her own ability to survive inside it. She went home to Nyxos' Aerie for 4 days before returning to Meridian Hall, because the ratification required a formal signature ceremony on the homeworld itself, and because her mother had not left the family's terraced hold above the Aerie's low-gravity capital in 11 years, and was not, at her age, going to make the journey to a station orbiting 3 light months away for any occasion short of this one. The hold sat on a ridge overlooking the Halon Seam's northern extraction fields, visible from her mother's window as a long pale scar of exposed crystal catching the thin blue light of Nyxos' Aerie's distant sun. The resource 3 centuries of trusteeship arithmetic had reduced to a line item, now, finally, her people's own to govern. Her mother met her at the door with the particular Nyxari embrace that used almost no muscle at all, forearms resting rather than gripping, because gripping cost more than either of them had grown up with calories to spare on, and held her there a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. "They're saying on the news feeds that you nearly died," her mother said, into her shoulder. "I nearly did several things. Dying wasn't the closest one." "That is not the comfort you think it is." Her mother pulled back to look at her properly, the way she had looked at her as a girl bringing home marks from clerking exams that were good, but never, in her mother's estimation, quite good enough to stop worrying about. "Your father used to say the trusteeship would outlive both of us, and we should build our lives around that fact instead of against it. I want you to know I am glad, every single day since the vote, that you did not listen to him. He wasn't wrong to be afraid, Mother. He was wrong about what to do with it." Her mother studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression settled, not quite pride, Liora understood, because pride implied a starting expectation her mother had never actually held for a body as fragile-seeming as the one she'd raised, but something adjacent to it, hard one and only just arrived at, Your father is not here to say it. I will say it instead, and you will let me, because I have earned the right after 11 years of worrying about you in that assembly. You were never the fragile one in this family, Liora. We simply spent a very long time letting other people believe otherwise, because it was safer than correcting them. I am glad you finally stopped. She found Tobin 3 days later in the small physical therapy annex, the Terran mission kept for exactly this kind of injury. His left arm in a sling, working through a set of range of motion exercises with the grim patience of a man who found recovery considerably less interesting than the work it was keeping him from. You're supposed to be resting, she said. I'm supposed to be a lot of things. Mostly I'm supposed to be standing 4 paces behind you at the next session, and this arm has opinions about the schedule I've given it to get there. She sat down across from him, in the plain chair the annex kept for visitors, and let the silence hold for a moment before she said the thing she had been turning over since the archive stare. You could have told me before this, what you actually were, what the sword actually meant past the ceremony of it. You could have told me what you were building in that office for 8 months instead of letting me guess it off your schedule. He said it without any real edge. The small, dry humor she had learned over 14 months was as close as he came to affection out loud. We were both keeping the parts of the job that would have scared the other one if we'd said them out loud too early. Seemed to work out. It worked because I didn't need rescuing, she said, and made sure the words landed the way she meant them, precise, unhurried, the register she used when something mattered too much to leave room for misreading. You bought me time on that floor. You didn't win the thing that actually needed winning. I did that in an archive vault with a keyboard nobody's manufactured in a century, and it would have worked whether or not you'd made it up that stairwell in time. I want you to understand that I know the difference, because I think for a long time this assembly is going to want to tell the story the easier way, the sword, the rescue, the pet turning out not to be one, and I'd rather you and I agreed now on which parts of it were actually true. Something in his expression shifted, some old professional wariness finally, fully, standing down. I know the difference, he said. I was in the room for both halves of it. I just got to the second one with a bigger prop. She almost laughed and let herself, this once, all the way through, without checking first whether laughing here was a tell that cost her anything. For what it's worth, she said, once the laugh had settled. Speaker Drow asked me, 3 days ago, whether the Terran mission's attaché would consider a permanent Assembly Security Commission when your posting here ends. I told her that was a question for you and not for me, but I want you to know I was tempted for about half a second to answer it myself. What stopped you? You'd have made a terrible commissioner. You hate committees more than I do, and I have spent 2 years pretending I don't. She said it lightly, but something steadier sat underneath it, and she let him hear that part too. I told her the truth instead, that the job description you actually care about isn't security in the abstract. It's one person in one room deciding they're not leaving it undefended. That's not a commission. That's a choice you make new every single day, and I don't think it transfers to a title. He considered that for a while, turning the range of motion device over once in his good hand before setting it down. She's not wrong that I hate committees, he said finally. Tell her I'm staying anyway, at least until this arm remembers what it's for. I already told her that part, Liora said. I told her before she finished asking. Outside the annex window, Meridian Hall's session bell rang the 15-minute call for the next floor debate. A resource allocation dispute between 2 mid-tier delegations. Nothing that would make any archive's front page. The ordinary unglamorous business of 1100 worlds arguing their way towards something that mostly worked. And Liora Sevrain, first-term senator from a moon that had spent 3 centuries being told it was too fragile to matter, rose to go be precisely as present in that ordinary business as she intended to be present in everyone after it, with or without a blade standing behind her, because she had learned, in the space of 9 extraordinary days, the exact weight of the difference between being protected and being underestimated, and she did not intend to let this assembly confuse the two again.